in as we move forward. So, hello, welcome everybody. My name is Rihanna Howard. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the interim director for the African American Resource and Cultural Center, also known as ARC on campus. And it is with my honor to welcome y'all to the first Pan African Research Fellowship Symposium, also known as PARF. It's been a year-long project almost, and I'm really excited to celebrate our three fellows today and all the hard work that they've put into this year. And so I'm going to now pass it to Aaron to introduce himself and say a few words as well.
Greetings all, my name is Aaron Jones. I use the pronouns he, him, and his, and I currently serve as the Interim Director for Educational Opportunity Programs, EOP, and I have served alongside Rihanna as the staff advisor to the students in the fellowship, as well as the principal investigator for the research that they've undertaken. I'm very as well honored to work alongside them and to witness the work that they've accomplished, and the hope that it brings for this campus if we follow through with their many of their recommendations. So thank you for being here.
Trying to switch. There you go. So before we get started, I want to start with a land acknowledgement to honor the land that we are on. So we would not be able to be here and to conduct the research that has been done. So UC Santa Cruz is located on the unceded territory of the Waswa speaking UP tribe. The Amamutan tribal band, comprised of the descendants of indigenous people taken to Mission Santa Cruz in San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma. So I'm going to go over the agenda today. We have a long session, but it's going to be good and great and informative, and there'll be time for y'all to engage with the fellows as well. So we're going to start off with a welcome. Aaron and I will do a brief PARF overview to kind of let you know how it started and then how we got to where we are today. And then I will be able to pass it off to our three fellows, Aya, Lindsay, and Maysoon, who will present on their research and will share their topics a little bit later. And then after that, we'll do some closing and thank yous. So pretty simple, and hopefully it will be a good presentation for y'all. Cool. Also, just to mention, we will have breaks after every presentation. So you'll have some time to stand up, stretch, grab some water, because self-care is a thing and we all should practice it. So I'm going to start off with the PARF overview. So this is our timeline, or what we were hoping our timeline would be. And Aaron and I will both kind of discuss some of the hiccups and roadblocks that we've encountered along the way. But PARF was created after BSU submitted an open letter to UCSC titling the Anti-Blackness of 2020, where there was a list of demands that were listed there by our students and by BSU. Those letters and demands are still today, but this is one of the ones that was talked about at the time. And so from there, PARF was created through a meeting that happened with a few folks in admin and a few of our students today to create this program. From there, meaning Aaron and myself, met with students, and we formulated kind of the processes of what PARF could be. From there, we created a selection process, had all the fellows interested, or the students interested, submit abstracts for what they wanted to do and what they wanted to research. And then Aaron, myself, and three other students who were not applying for the program came together to select our 8 fellows. So we started with 8 fellows at the time. From there, we created a structure where we created monthly meetings where we met as a team, and then weekly or bi-weekly meetings with myself and Aaron. And we slowly lost some fellows along the way. And this is due to, and Aaron can speak to as well, We originally started this thinking it was going to be a summer program. We were only going to be working on it through the summer, and we realized quickly that it was going to be a lot longer than that. And one of the biggest roadblocks that we hit was the IRB process. So the IRB process took about 2 months, looking at Erin, about 2 months for us to get IRB approval. And so that pushed us back from September almost to about January. So maybe a little longer than 2 months. And so we finally were able to get approval around January to start the process of actually conducting the research and the surveys, the interviews that were done. And so we had a little bit of hiatus, but through there, our scholars and fellows were able to work on literature reviews, really fine tune their methods, and really engage with the process that way. But we did intend to end around September. However, here we are today. So a little update about how our timeline went.
So again, to talk a little further about the sort of main elements of the program, we set out to do this as a pilot. So we knew that we were trying something out that didn't sort of exist in the same format. There are other programs, of course, on our campus that are, internships, research internships and fellowships of varying kinds. But sort of the intention behind this program as a way to really take a deep dive into the challenges that a particular community is undergoing and utilizing research as a means by which to investigate those things and create actionable steps for the institution was what makes this program very unique. And also the pay that we enlist for our fellows is much different than others. And we have provided funding for for fall, winter, and spring, and support for other elements that they need, such as a laptop and software, such as in Vivo, which is a qualitative coding software, and any other things that the students have needed along the way. And again, these are student-initiated projects. So they weren't created by Rihanna or I. They identified their own topics. They did a deep dive into the relevant literature around that topic, and they identified their own methods. The two of us sort of provided sort of input based upon our experiences, but it is truly a student-initiated effort. But along the way, research is for those of you that are listening today, because there are people in the room, and there also might be people that are listening that are not here with us right now. You might have experience with research, and everyone has varying experience in research. And so I gave a couple of, sort of sessions to talk through various processes, such as, why is research important? Why are we sort of using that as the crux of how we figure out what to do, and what actions might be best? As a scholar practitioner myself, I utilize action research in my dissertation, and so that was definitely a major frame to what we're talking about. But I'll talk more about the theoretical frameworks in a moment. But I imparted that with the students, as well as providing them resources from other types of research and explaining those types of research. The IRB process, which was very involved, and we won't get into the details, but I will say that my hope is that with the new process of IRB, that what happened to us won't happen to folks in the future, where our application was sort of lost in someone's spam. But teaching the students about that process was really important. How to define your research question, methodologies related to asking questions in interviews and developing surveys, and coding and analysis. I will surface as well that we had a lot of support from Teresa, who is a graduate student who works in the EOP office, and she was a great support. Not anything that we sort of had, an inkling that we were going to include before, but became a vital resource to many of the students in understanding qualitative coding. And so, we found a way for us to, provide some appreciation to Teresa as well, because that's really important to, again, go back to the point of this is that we're compensating students for their labor and their work. And so I think Rihanna mentioned a little bit already that we met regularly as we could with all of the fellows, because again, it was very challenging to sort of support this program. And it's a robust program. And, while I have, and Rihanna has levels of expertise, finding that time in the week is very challenging when you have competing priorities, with our home departments. And so that was a challenge, but I think we did the best we could to sort of provide as much support as possible, and then providing alternative avenues like including Teresa in our efforts. As well, we are expecting in the completion of this program and process for there to be a report from each of the fellows on their research, as well as them sharing their personal reflections about the challenges and the successes from the program. It's really important that as we will continue the program past this point, but we have to essentially learn from the folks that were involved in this initial pilot in order for it to be the best experience possible for both the staff and/or faculty and/or grad students that are supporting, as well as the students themselves in the carrying out of the research. And then as well, the final thing, of course, is this public presentation that we will share the recording with. We'll try to figure out a home for it, or the best possible way for us to continue to share with folks outside of this place. But we definitely are completely and 100% willing to share afterward. Next slide. So again, I told you I was going to talk a little bit about theoretical perspectives. So I will as well try to be brief, because again, it's not about me, but it is about our students. But I think even without prompting, critical race theory emerged as sort of the most prime theoretical framework to guide the work that they do in their research. And it's so interesting that now it's sort of this hot topic now, in the public ethos to talk about critical race theory, and for politicians to try to block its use. And so essentially, if you're not aware, the 5 major tenets, and there are a lot of different tenets as well, because it's a very expansive theoretical framework and frame of analysis. The 5 major points, though, I'll just share briefly. First is counter storytelling, so countering a dominant narrative, and I think each project seeks to unearth the true experiences of students here, and in a way that is not about the research being generalizable. It's not about applying what we learn to every single student, but to understand the experiences of these particular students that surface their troubles and their challenges, and how we can address those, and eventually address a lot of various challenges for our students. The second is that we critical race theorists, we agree that racism is endemic to society. It's something that is ingrained in a lot of the policies, systems, and institutions that we interact with every day. And until we understand that and acknowledge that and speak about that, we'll never be able to dismantle them. The third thing is interest convergence, is that the folks in power usually need to have some skin in the game. They need to, you typically will change things if they have some sort of interest in some of those changes that happen. And so that is really an important part as we think about our institution and our values. And if the institution changes some elements, then the institution will have some benefit as well. Fourth is whiteness as property, and the importance of understanding that the possession of whiteness as an identity is one that is steeped in privileges and advantages that are exclusionary to anyone who does not possess whiteness, and provides opportunities to people that position themselves in proximity to whiteness, even if they themselves do not possess it. And so it's a commodity. It's not necessarily an actual cultural space or identity. And then the last thing is the critique of liberalism, that just being liberal is not enough, and to say that you're for particular folks or particular ideals is not enough. That even in some of the seminal court cases for civil rights, just because it's supposed to be lauded as something really great doesn't mean that it fully encapsulates all of what we need to do to make things more fair for everyone. And then action research is another main point here, that we need to understand that practitioner research, like the research of folks that do the day-to-day work, is important as well, and that anyone can do research if they have the proper training to do so. And it's really about asking questions of the work that is being done, and identifying ways that maybe different work can be done, or the work can be done in different ways in order to achieve the goals that you intend. And then there's this process of observing and reflecting on what you observe, and then acting, doing something to really shift the things that are happening, evaluating whether or not that worked, and then going back through this cycle of modifying as need be and doing more observation, right? So I think these two things are really important for folks to understand in this process, that they could literally take these projects and continue to work on them beyond this time frame, because they are things that we can continue to look at and investigate. But I know as well that folks are graduating, but I have invited them, and they have expressed some interest. Please, stop me if I'm jumping to conclusions here, but really looking at their work as publishable work, and work that needs to be in the annals of the literature around supporting ABC students. Next slide. And so with that, I will pass it on to Rihanna to introduce our scholars.
So I'm really excited to introduce y'all, words are hard, introduce y'all to our 3 fellows. So we started with 8, and we have 3 amazing Black women who are our fellows here. And I'm so excited to share a little bit about them with you before they share their presentation with you a little bit later. So Aya, who will be our first presenter, is doing a presentation on hate bias reporting systems, the impact of microaggressions on ABC student wellness and sense of belonging at Ucsc. I won't share too much about each of these projects because they will share their presentation, but I'm really excited for Aya to share her results and findings from a program that she created called SCORE on our campus. Next presentee would be Lindsay, who will be presenting on No Place Like Home, No Space to Find Solace, the relationship between the Santa Cruz housing crisis, academic achievement, and well-being for Black UC Santa Cruz students. I'm really excited to look at the possibilities from the results of Lindsay's research to show about how we can talk more about basic needs in general, but also looking at housing and the impact that it has on our Black students, specifically at UC Santa Cruz, and a little look at what other campuses are doing as well. And then lastly, our last presenter, our last fellow is Maysoon, who will be speaking about safe spaces for Black Muslim students. I'm really also excited. You can tell I really like all three of our fellows for Maysoon's research as well. This is research that she's been doing with Saskia, who's a wonderful faculty member on campus. And I think it's a topic we don't talk about very often, or if at all, within academia. And so I'm really excited for Maysoon to shed light and show experiences for our Black Muslim students on our campus. And I'm going to pass it back to Erin to finish us up with fellowship goals, and then we will get started with presentations right after.
Right. I had a moment where I had to remember that this last one was me. So as I've mentioned a little bit about what we intend to do when we talked about our timeline and we talked about the elements of the fellowship, one of the first things here is to really identify some substantiation of the claims of the ABC students' demands, and that they are not asking these things out of a vacuum, that there is research that could exist, but through their investigation that could point us towards the way of transformative action. And as well, it really was about learning how to work collaboratively. I won't sort of say that we want to get rid of protest and demonstration, but we want to find the best possible ways for staff, faculty, students to work together to resolve the issues of our campus, that we are a community together, and it is only through working together that we can make the necessary changes. And lastly, the ongoing part of this process will be to identifying that roadmap of where have we been and where further do we need to go, and what kind of action steps can we take on after they share what they've learned. And with that, Aya, take us away.
I'm going to pause just for a second. I'm going to stop share and then reshare. I just need to update the presentation, and then I will introduce Aya.
Or not, it's fine.
Give me 1 second. Technical difficulties.
I'm just ready. I'm just ready to hear Aya's presentation again. I don't know if that's I don't know if that's where that comes from, but yeah.
Okay. I think, let me just refresh one last time to make sure that we are good to go, and then I will share it back. And just a reminder, as I'm doing this too, that y'all will have a chance to ask questions after each presentation, and then also at the end of all three presentations as well. So if questions pop up as folks are presenting, and you're like, oh, I wish I asked that before, you'll definitely get a chance to ask it again after all three. So let me go ahead and share my screen one last time. Okay, cool. So y'all should be able to see that. Perfect. So I have the honor to introduce each of our fellows as they present again. And so our first presenter is going to be Aya, who is a 4th year graduating student. So proud. All of our students are graduating and or just graduated. So I'm really excited for this to be one of the final projects and results as they do before they leave UCSC, but they have definitely left a mark on our campus. And so I think this is another just etch into that mark. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Aya.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Thumbs up. Okay, cool. My name is Ayodele Abdul-Hadi, and I'm a Pan-African Research Fellow, and this is my presentation called Hate Bias Systems and the Impact of Microaggressions on ABC Student Wellness and Sense of Belonging at UC Santa Cruz. Next slide. So for today's presentation, I will discuss why this research is important. Then I will go into my research question and timeline. And then I will discuss SCORE, the creation of an organization I started in the fall, along with barriers to ABC student success and the data collection from the Pan-African Research Fellowships Survey. And I will close with a brief discussion and answer any questions. So why is this research important? As a Black student, I have had many experiences of microaggressions. In my past 4 years at UC Santa Cruz, I have only had 3 Black professors and only 1 Black female professor who's at this presentation right now. Shout out Teresa. And that was made possible with the Black Studies minor, which is only just recently been established at UC Santa Cruz. According to UC Santa Cruz fall demographics data in 2020, Black students make up 4.6% of the undergraduate student population, while white European students make up 30% of the undergraduate student population. The problem of underrepresentation is further reflected in the lack of ABC identified faculty and staff. The UCSC IRAPS enrollment data found that 0.4% of lecturers are African Black and 63.5% are white, and this is from 2020. That same report also found that 2.9% of professional staff are African Black, whereas 56% are white. Next slide, please. So what started as a 3-month summer fellowship became a year-long program. As Rihanna and Aaron mentioned, we started in the summer of last year, where I created an abstract for the project and met with UCSC admin. I was also able to meet with the UC Office of the President and discuss system-wide hate bias systems. In fall quarter, I began working on the ABC Hate Bias Task Force, which later became SCORE, and I'll talk a little bit about that later in my presentation. And then this past winter quarter, I was finally able to send out a survey. The IRB process was very long and involved, as you've heard, but we were able to collect information and data that hadn't previously been collected and include that in my final results. And so I'm happy to say that SCORE, the organization I created, has secured funding for the next year. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means in the next slides. So my initial research questions were, what will be the impact, increase, decrease, or stay the same in the percentage of hate bias reports with a more transparent hate bias system? And I was also looking at how will the improved accessibility and transparency of the hate bias reporting system change the community environment, student belonging, and overall campus climate for ABC students. What I realized after my preliminary research in the summer of 2020 was that there was a clear lack of transparent data available regarding tracking microaggressions at UC Santa Cruz and across the UC system. I had met with most offices that related to hate bias data collection at UC Santa Cruz, including but not limited to the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, the Academic Personnel Office, the African American Resource Center, IRAPS, CITL, and a bunch of other ones. I also met multiple times with the UCOP Associate Vice Provost for Graduate and Undergraduate Affairs, Liz Halima, and Yvette Goulat, the Vice President for Graduate and Undergraduate Affairs in the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. I know it's a mouthful, but basically UCOP's ODEI office. I realized that there needed to be a concerted effort in assisting the accessibility and transparency of UC Santa Cruz's hate bias program, collect data, and to educate BIPOC students about this resource. So I proposed the ABC Hate Bias Task Force, which became SCORE, which stands for the Student-Led Campus Climate Organization for Research and Equity. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide. So this is the SCORE team, my wonderful SCORE team who I've been working with since since winter quarter. We had hiring and onboarding in late fall quarter, and It was really great to work with the team. SCORE exists to work on making a more accessible and transparent hate bias response program. And me, along with the SCORE team, collectively wrote a very comprehensive report on hate bias systems at UC Santa Cruz. In our report, we compiled and analyzed 4 key findings from the Pan-African Research Survey that I sent out back in February. Next slide. So in the report, we outlined specific recommendations in regards to improving the transparency and accessibility of the UCSC hate bias system, along with recommendations to improve the campus climate for African, Black, and Caribbean students. And I highly recommend that all of you read through it and utilize the data to inform your teaching practices and understanding of campus climate at UC Santa Cruz moving forward. Next slide. So one of the key findings from my final report with SCORE was that the campus climate for African, Black, and Caribbean identified students was not welcoming. And the 3 main barriers that were mentioned by students from the PARF survey was access to resources, campus climate, and a small community. Access to resources related to Black therapists, lack of Black faculty, and needing additional programs to support ABC students, including more financial aid. Campus climate related to poor experiences with anti-Black faculty and staff, racist students, and a complacent administration. And the small community related to the very small percentage of Black students, faculty, and staff on campus, which impacts student mental health, can cause imposter syndrome, and feeling like an outsider or like students who are African, Black, or Caribbean don't belong on campus. Next slide. This student quote was taken from the PARF survey. The lack of understanding of how difficult it is to be Black at this school. The lack of community, professors underestimating you, students treating you lesser in study groups or ignoring you, hearing racist comments all over campus and nothing being truly done about it. Lack of taking accountability from the school. I feel like I can't be myself sometimes. So how do we address this? Well, in terms of resources, securing more funding for the African American Resource Center and our counseling services is really important. And also bringing more awareness to students about the resources that are available, such as the Hate Bias Report Form. In terms of campus climate, there are different levels to it. But one place to start is having more than just a few difficult conversations with faculty and staff, but taking action. Creating accountability so that there's a general sense and understanding among the UCSC community that not only are there principles of community, but that these principles are upheld and implemented. In terms of a small community, this relates to retention. So keeping the ABC identified students at UCSC and doing outreach to new transfers and freshmen who are considering UC Santa Cruz. I can honestly say that if I had not had a program like Black Academy to engage with me as a Black student at UC Santa Cruz, I would most likely not be here today. And all of these things relate to strong support systems, which we will talk about later in the presentation. As a community, we cannot claim to have an inclusive and diverse campus climate if students still feel alienated and alone because they experience microaggressions or marginalization. Next slide. So what we see in this graph taken from the 2021 PARF survey is that most ABC identified students experience racial bias. Now, this is not surprising when you take into consideration the small population and limited resources that are available to students. However, what is particularly impactful is that now we have this data to back up our lived experiences as ABC students at UC Santa Cruz. Next slide. So this graph is taken from the UCSC Hate Bias Response Program report in the 2016-2017 academic year. And it essentially says that the primary category of bias people have experienced is race. And in the 5 years that those reports have been collected, the highest number of reports received was 151 total in the 2016-17 academic year. And since then, the number of reports has fluctuated between 80 to 95 reports per year. During that time, UC Santa Cruz has had a student population of approximately 18,000 students. So the math just doesn't add up. The responses from the 2021 PARF survey showed that 43% of respondents had experienced instances of microaggressions more than 3 times in their interactions with UCSC affiliated students, faculty, and staff, and these microaggressions were based on ancestry or race. The survey also found that 47% of respondents had witnessed microaggressions related to ancestry or race in their interactions with UCSC affiliated faculty, students, and staff. However, only 8% of respondents have used the report hate form. So the data suggests that students are not reporting incidences because of the lack of knowledge about the hate bias reporting form. This is supported by the PARF data that shows over 70% of respondents who did the survey had never even heard of the hate bias program. Next slide, please. So this section, I'm going to talk about some of my recommendations for improving campus climate for ABC identified students. The first is to hire and retain more staff from the ABC community to foster a sense of belonging for ABC students. To hire more mental health professionals who specialize in the effects of racial stereotypes and microaggressions affecting the ABC community. To build cultural proficiency across campus through a continued education requirement of anti-racist teaching practices for faculty, staff, and teaching assistants. To prioritize ABC student-led organizations and research opportunities, like SCORE and PARF, with strong support systems. And lastly, to implement the Black Student Union's demand for the university to have a zero-tolerance policy for hate, discrimination, prejudice, and bias, with tangible consequences for students, faculty, and staff. Next slide. So this next section will look at the UCSC hate bias system versus the UC-wide intolerance report form. And the purpose of the hate bias form is to collect student data on microaggressions and hate bias incidences, to illustrate that students experience, to illustrate the student experience while attending UC Santa Cruz, and to identify and address areas of improvement for the campus climate and inclusiveness at UCSC. Next slide. So this chart looks at the data collection methods across 9 UC campuses, and the decision to create a system-wide intolerance report form resulted from several nooses that were found on UC campuses and a blackface party that was held at UC San Diego. The UC president at the time formed an advisory committee and asked each campus to create a campus climate committee and conduct a campus climate report. And that was published in 2014. The system-wide intolerance report form utilizes Ethics Point, which is a different incident management software than Advocate, which is utilized by UC Santa Cruz and our report hate form. Currently, there is not a streamlined software program to track hate bias incidences. Each campus uses different software and program format. Next slide. While reading through the 2014 Campus Climate Report from UC Santa Cruz and the UC-wide System 1, I found it interesting that the UC system defined their terms and separated categories of people of color into different categories. So what you're looking at right here, there's the underrepresented minority, the other people of color, and the multi-minority. And why is this? Essentially because it helps interpret the data that they've been collecting in a more favorable way. The 2014 Campus Climate Report found that underrepresented minority and multi-minority respondents were less comfortable than white respondents and other people of color in terms of workplace climate. So it wasn't surprising that white respondents were more comfortable with the campus climate than other racial groups. But it was interesting that other people of color respondents, i.e. Asian American, Middle Eastern, Southwest Asian, North African, and Pacific Islanders, were more comfortable with campus climate than ABC identified American Indian, Alaska Native, and Hispanic and Latino respondents. Keep in mind, all of these identities are underrepresented minorities, but they were separated out. And these identities are all BIPOC communities and do experience poor campus climate. Next slide. So what do the current forms, hate bias forms look like? This is a side-by-side comparison of the UCSC hate bias system and the UC-wide intolerance report form. The UCSC report form is formatted differently than the system-wide intolerance report form, which asks, what is the primary category of bias, rather than the issue involved. This is a way to group the types of incidences before categorizing the type of bias that's experienced. Next slide. And the UCSC form then continues and allows students to select an additional category of bias. So students filling out the form can select one primary category of bias and then as many other secondary categories of bias that they've experienced. Whereas the system-wide report only allows students to select one primary category of bias. And something to note is that the UCSC report hate form, there is not a set definition of race versus ancestry or ethnicity. If you look in the top, right below age, it says ancestry/ethnicity, and then further down, it says below pregnancy, it says race. And this creates some ambiguity when filling out the form. It's a complicated subject, but I think it would be hugely beneficial for the hate bias form to have some parameters for definitions so that students can better understand and know how to categorize their hate bias experiences. Next slide. So, in summary, the three things to take away from this presentation are that the campus climate for ABC students is subpar, that there is a lack of transparent and accessible data about the campus climate, and that there is an unorganized and not streamlined hate bias system UC-wide or even within UC Santa Cruz. And those are my three main takeaways. Next, we will go into discussion, and if you guys have any questions, I can answer them. Hopefully, I can answer them. That's the end of my presentation. This is the discussion time, so we can maybe stop sharing if people want to have it be like, yeah. Thank you. Any questions?
What will be really helpful is if folks use the raise your hand feature, and as well, if you are unwilling or uncomfortable with voicing your question, feel free to send a private chat to Rihanna or myself, and we're happy to voice your question aloud as well. So our first question that I can see is Cindy, and then Teresa.
Thank you. Well, I first wanted to start by thanking Brianna and Aaron for the introduction today, and thank you, Ayo. Can you help me to know how to say it?
Ayodele.
Ayodele. It's such a pretty name. Thank you. I wanted to try and get it out all right, and sometimes I'm not so articulate, so I apologize for that. I had some questions, and they may be a little bit granular for today. And so if you'd like to just say we should discuss that in another session, that'd be great. I don't want to get us too bogged down. I was interested in all of your points and would like us to make progress on them. But I feel because of the opportunity that Linda Schultz's promotion to another role at New Mexico State creates within the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, it's really a good time to rethink hate bias on our campus. And so, you know, I was looking at the forms that you showed for the Office of the President's system. That doesn't seem to be a perfect solution for us. I understand that there are limitations with our current hate bias form. So, and then there's the hate bias process that we probably have to think about in a larger context about how we manage that process. But if we just think about the form, I would like to be interested in your opinion about whether the form itself could be modified or if we should just start from fresh.
I think the form can be modified, and my recommendations are in the paper that I shared with you, specifically outlining how that can be best addressed.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I would also notice that most of the other campuses use Ethics Point. And I think we have access to Ethics Point on our campus.
Ethics Point, it's utilized. So if a student accesses a system-wide intolerance form rather than our form to submit their hate bias incident, then it's processed through Ethics Point. If a student directly utilizes our hate bias form, it's processed through Advocate. The problem is Ethics Point is old. It's like from 2000. Like, it's a very outdated system. I'm not as familiar with Advocate, but I know it's a more updated system. And even APO, our academic personnel office, is in the process of utilizing a new software. You'd have to talk with them about that specifically, but that's another alternative as well.
Thank you. Thank you. I think those were most of my questions for now. I wanted to give somebody else a turn, but I may come back later. Thank you.
Awesome. Teresa?
Hi, I am so, thank you so much for your presentation and your very hard work throughout this year on this project and with organizing SCORE, which is amazing and extremely necessary. I have a question about the point that you made in your recommendations, all of which I thought were excellent, about your zero tolerance recommendation. So in the Student Conduct Task Force, currently one of the things we've been grappling with is the fact that Black and Latinx men and non-binary students on campus are overrepresented in conduct reports. And so there's always a concern that any sort of anything to do with conduct is going to be negative for our ABC students, right? And also in trying to think about other ways of approaching conduct issues. So could you think with me a little bit about how we could emphasize zero tolerance for racism on campus and racist acts on campus, while also not trying to turn too much towards a formal conduct process?
Yeah, I actually was in, because I know the Student Code of Conduct is undergoing like a review process, and I was in one of the discussion conversations with like the guest, I don't know, auditors, if that's the term, but like the guest university. And that was a conversation that came up in that, you know, people of color are definitely targeted with the process, and especially as it relates to activism on campus and holding students accountable for their actions and holding the university accountable. And I think part of the problem is that within our conduct structure, there's not as much of a understanding of how these different inequalities affect each other. And I think it's about formatting the code of conduct in a way that's more expansive and takes into more consideration different environments or different unequal distributions of power and stereotypes that impact why a certain group or identity is being targeted. In the recommendation, it is specifically about racist incidents. You know, we had a noose hung at our campus just last summer. And so I think that that is a really honest conversation that needs to be had about what will it take to make it so that these incidences don't occur anymore, and that it changes the culture of our like community at UC Santa Cruz, because we have a reputation of being quite liberal, but I don't know any liberal colleges that have had multiple nooses hung on their campus or that have had multiple instances of students being arrested while they're peacefully protesting or have had these different types of things happening. So it's kind of, it seems to be like a facade, and I'm basically calling the university and saying, look, if you're gonna talk the talk, then you gotta walk the walk, like have the actions that back up what you're saying, essentially. And again, that's also not my role as a person of color. Like, I think it really does fall on the privileged and white people who are in the administration to think collectively about how they can stop targeting BIPOC communities and like trans communities, as opposed to like holding accountable racist white students or faculty who have tenure or who have the protection of freedom of speech that are utilizing it and like basically using it as a power tool to like continue to spread hate and an uninclusive campus environment.
Thanks so much. And I wanted to add to onto that a question about faculty roles in a zero tolerance policy of racism in the classroom or even in assignments, you know, that maybe not all of the students see, but something that's addressing all of that behavior that faculty need to play a role in.
And really quickly on that note, I know that we do have resources through the Keep Teaching portal that provides workshops to faculty and staff about how to not be racist in your teaching practices or in your climate, but it's not required. There's not like a required anti-Blackness training for faculty. And so because it's optional, like the people who are taking the workshops are usually not the problematic people. So that's part of the issue as well. So there are some resources that are available, but it's not necessarily targeting the audience that needs to be hearing it most.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Lindsay.
Yeah, thanks everybody for asking your questions, and thank you, Aya, for an amazing presentation. I think that Teresa's question is a good segue for me to ask a little bit more about the future of the hate bias team at UCSC. And so something that I noticed a couple of years ago at UCSC was that, and I don't know if this is still the case, but I think the last time I checked it was where like it was an entirely white team made up of folks that like didn't have much diversity and also like mostly men too. And so I'm wondering, you know, if something like SCORE is going to continue into the future and kind of like how having some more people of color and also like specifically Black folks on the hate bias response team could influence the thing that Teresa was mentioning as far as like an over-representation in like hate bias reporting for like Black and POC populations, but also like the way that those reports are being conducted. Like if there's more severity because of implicit bias, right? And so like if like mostly white people are managing those reports, if there's more severity versus like if there was more diversity on that team, and to be able to fully assess the matter, like how the response would be in that case. So do you know if SCORE will be continuing or what the future of that looks like?
Yeah, SCORE is continuing. I mean, I met with the chancellor last week and our SCORE team, we presented our findings, and we also outlined like specific recommendations for the SCORE team to include at least one African, Black, or Caribbean identified student and have the whole team be underrepresented students of color. And in terms of the actual team, the hate bias response team, that was another one of our recommendations, is to have an permanent ABC identified person on the team, because currently the response team will like consult with ARC or with the Cantu Queer Center, but you know, that's only if it's flagged by the person who's reading through the reports. And right now that individual is a white woman. And so that doesn't mean there's not as an expansive lived experience when you're not necessarily a person of color or part of the LGBT community or a Muslim. Like you can't always understand the different levels of hate bias that are being experienced and in how it's categorized, which goes back to what I was saying, that race, ethnicity, and ancestry are all kind of separated. And it is a complex kind of lexicon, but at the same time, having some sort of standard helps with the tracking and creation of like data for future analysis. But yeah, there's not very much diversity on the team, but they do like consult with other offices that have people of those lived communities. But I agree that there needs to be permanent members on the team and expand the diversity of the response team who are going through the reports.
Thank you, Aya.
Yeah, of course. Any other questions? Okay, well, I mean, I think we'll probably continue with the presentation. Again, I'm so glad that you guys enjoyed my presentation. I also hope that you guys have the chance to read my paper that goes in more in depth and has a lot more recommendations in terms of improving the accessibility and transparency of the hate bias program, and does a little bit of a historical review of why it is that we have these systems in place. Also looking a little bit more at the data I collected from my survey. So thank you, and I'll pass it over to Rihanna.
Thank you so much, Aya. That was a great presentation, and always listening to you answer questions is just a great thing to watch. I think you're a great presenter, so I'm excited that other folks got to witness that as well. We're going to be heading off into a 5-minute break, so feel free to turn your videos off. I'll be playing some lo-fi music, and we'll be back at 1:07. Okay, perfect. Let's go ahead and get started again. I hope your break was good. You were able to grab some water, maybe a snack. I'm so excited to introduce our next presenter, Lindsay, who will be talking about housing and connections to academic achievement. And so I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Lindsay now.
Thanks, Rihanna, and thanks again, everyone, for being here today. My name is Lindsay Tavares Sabito. I use she, her pronouns. I'm going to be presenting with my camera off just to save my internet connection, and hopefully I'll be here for the whole time of the presentation. And yeah, I will be presenting my Pan-African Research Fellowship project titled No Place Like Home, No Place to Find Solace, the relationship between the Santa Cruz housing crisis, academic achievement, and well-being for Black UC Santa Cruz students. Next slide, please. So before we jump in, just to give you a brief overview of what we'll be discussing today. First, I'll start with an introduction that includes the historical context and demographic information around the Santa Cruz housing crisis, and also the history of African Americans in Santa Cruz. And then I will discuss the problem that we'll be focusing on in this project. I'll talk about the purpose and significance of this work. And then next, I will discuss my research approach. I'll outline the different questions that I had in consideration, the theoretical framework I used, and methodology. Next, I'll discuss the data summary, so my data analysis and some significant findings. From there, I'll go ahead and talk about some recommendations that students brought up in their research interviews. And I'll also share one of my own recommendations. And from here, I'll conclude with some final thoughts, and we'll have some time for a quick Q&A. So introduction, historical context, and demographics. Next slide, please. So in the United States in general, and in Santa Cruz, I'm not sure if you're aware, but there is an affordable housing crisis where people can't afford to pay for housing. What this means is that there's been a decreased life quality since a large portion of people's income goes to pay for housing. And so this issue affects the right to safe, affordable housing for certain demographics. Consequently, it also means that vulnerable populations are forced to move, are frequently displaced from their communities, and are dealing with subpar living standards. To contextualize the problem of affordability, we can reference the Demographa International Housing Affordability Survey, which rates middle income housing affordability by taking the median home price divided by the median income. And data from 2018 shows that Santa Cruz is the least affordable housing market in the US and around the 4th least affordable in the world, which is really shocking because there's a lot of other places to consider, but we are ranked at the very top. And so, yeah, this raises a huge concern, especially when it comes to more vulnerable populations. And so in the report of the rise of the renter nation, they found that federal housing policy and the private housing market is what causes housing insecurity for renters, whom they mean are also increasing in number. And these negative impacts are greatest for historically marginalized and socioeconomic exposed groups. A contributing factor to this deep housing crisis is that rents keep going up while salaries don't. So to see how unaffordable housing is for middle income people, this gives us an idea of how severe it might be for low income people. This issue is also compounded when identity comes into play for renters in pursuit of housing in Santa Cruz. Racial exclusion in housing is a systemic process fundamentally tied to the control of land and power to decide who is able to call a place home, right? And the earliest forms of racial exclusion in the Bay Area were the violent dispossession of Native Americans' land and concentration of ownership of land by Spanish, Mexican, and early US settlers and governments. These origins of exclusion, state violence, and dispossession are ultimately what legislated the right to property in the United States, and Santa Cruz was no exception in this process. UC Santa Cruz was no exception in this process. Furthermore, the legacy of exclusionary zoning and racialized public housing policies are the foundation of concentrated wealth and poverty, gentrification and displacement in Santa Cruz County and the greater Bay Area. Inequality in the Santa Cruz housing market is actually what gave rise to the Santa Cruz chapter of the NAACP over 100 years ago. In Phil Reeder's article, To Know My Name, A Chronological History of African Americans in Santa Cruz County, he notes a particular shift in attitude towards African Americans in the early 20th century. So for a long time, there were no Black people in Santa Cruz, and it wasn't until the 19th century that African Americans started to arrive during the gold rush for work, things like that. And it wasn't until the 20th century that he claims there was a shift in attitude, and that the cause of this sudden change was because of economic recession, fierce job competition brought on by the arrival of large numbers of European immigrants, and also the county's continuing reliance upon tourism as its basic industry. However, the major reason was also due to patriotism, anti-foreignism, and isolationist tendencies, which ran rampant during the period of World War I. And so we see how these harmful attitudes made finding housing and jobs an impossible task for Black families. And so many people left the area in anger and discouragement. And we can still feel the effects of this history today. Next slide, please. So throughout the 200+ year history of Santa Cruz County, African Americans are without a question the invisible minority. The 2019 census for Santa Cruz reported that only 1.9% of the population was Black or African American alone, compared to 75.4% of the population being white alone and 21.1% of the population being Hispanic or Latino. And at the UC Santa Cruz level, the Office of Institutional Research, Assessment, and Policy Studies released demographic data for 2020, reporting an average of 4.4% African American or Black undergraduate students and 3.4% graduate students. In comparison, about 30% of all students recorded were white, and a 2018 report shows that 60% of all employees were white. Next slide, please. So moving into now the problem, purpose, and significance. Next slide. So just like briefly, I want to express to y'all like the reason why I chose this study also has to do with personal experiences that I've had since I transferred to UCSC in 2018, mainly around housing insecurity, basic needs insecurity, declined well-being, and a low sense of belonging and imposter syndrome due to all of the factors that I outlined earlier. And so what the problem is, and how I frame the problem for this research study, is that UCSC has an unmet need for the designation of ABC-themed housing for all ABC students, especially ones without guaranteed housing. So those who don't meet the priority list, including second and third year transfers, juniors and seniors, grad students, et cetera. Further, UCSC has yet to establish low rent, off-campus, culturally themed housing for students, staff, and faculty. There's a lack of safe and respectful spaces for people of color in Santa Cruz, and just a general lack of awareness around racial equality, social justice, et cetera, and an unacceptably small ABC student population. Next slide. So the purpose of this study is to provide input on barrier identification in the areas of ABC student housing, wellness, learning, and engagement at UC Santa Cruz. And this project specifically seeks to understand the experiences of ABC students and determine if there's a relationship between housing, academic achievement, and well-being for Black UC Santa Cruz students. And so once this project is completed, I will be presenting, which I'm doing today, and I will also be sharing a report with administrators and hopefully with the greater public as well. Furthermore, the goal of this research project is for students, faculty, and staff to work collaboratively, engage in creative problem solving, and inspire racially equitable progress at UCSC's campus. So again, just to reiterate, the expected outcome and significance of this project is to meet the demands for the designation of ABC themed housing for ABC students without guaranteed housing, which was stated by the Black Student Union in June 2020. Also, hopefully to establish an external ABC advisory committee to oversee that future UCSC housing projects and decisions implement priority-based selection for the benefit of Black students, facing housing injustice due to economic and racial barriers in Santa Cruz's already competitive and limited housing market. And then finally, my hope is that we can develop more intentional programming that fosters cultural competency and intelligence by maintaining safe, respectful space for people of color in I wrote predominantly white institution, even though I know we are now a Hispanic serving institution. That was a recent change, but still living in a predominantly white city. And so, yeah, by taking on this responsibility of maintaining a safe and respectful space for people of color, hopefully we can more appropriately address issues pertaining to the ABC community on campus and at large. Next slide. So my research approach. First, some of the questions that I'm asking in my research project include, what is the relationship between the Santa Cruz housing crisis, academic success, and well-being for Black UCSC students? What are the experiences of Black students who live on campus and also off campus? What are the experiences of students who live in Black-themed on-campus housing? And how can agents within social and political institutions transform the living and learning experiences of Black students through policy and practice? So like Erin mentioned earlier, I won't get too deep into it again, but I will be using critical race theory as my theoretical framework to address the housing experiences of ABC students, campus racial climate, and racial microaggressions. And then from here, the methodology that I used includes a very thorough literature search and analysis on the housing experiences of ABC college students, factors that contribute to Black student well-being, retention, and academic success, the history of racially exclusionary housing in the San Francisco Bay Area, issues in retention and graduation, and many more that I won't list for the sake of time. From here, after I completed my literature review, I conducted semi-structured interviews. Once I did my literature review, I conducted semi-structured research interviews. And I used qualitative methods to understand what the relationship between Black student housing experience and academic success were. To collect qualitative data, there was a set of approximately 30 questions that were carefully constructed and administered during 60-minute semi-structured interviews. They were all orally conducted by me and recorded through note-taking and audio recording. This project included a total of 14 individual research interviews via Zoom with participants who are current UCSC students belonging to and identifying as African, Black, or Caribbean. And it's important to note that this sample size is not fully representative of the ABC student experience at UCSC because there are varying intersectional identities and experiences that each ABC person has. However, the data that was shared and collected is significant nonetheless. And then from here, all the interview responses were thematically coded, and my sources of evidence were collected from interview transcripts, researchers' field notes, and supplemental literature in order to come to a logical set of conclusions and recommendations that address the issue of ABC student housing, academic success, and well-being. So great, okay, so First, when it comes to my data summary, I want to talk a little bit about these overarching themes that I had. And so they're listed here as academic success, ABC, housing experiences, institutional support, and well-being. And interview subjects discussed all of these different themes in varying ways. And then all of the subtitles that I have listed underneath were different codes that I used to denote when participants had mentions of those experiences. And due to time constraints, I won't be able to share all of my findings with you today. However, I will share a couple of overarching themes and significant findings in my analysis. Next slide. So poor racial campus climate. And this is something that Aya touched on, but I'll go into it a little bit more in depth. So the lead consultant at the UC Office of the President defines campus climate as the current attitudes, behaviors, and standards of faculty, staff, administrators, and students concerning the level of respect for individual needs, abilities, and potential. Many scholars assert that a positive collegiate racial climate can facilitate and lead to important positive academic outcomes for African-American students. On the contrary, a negative or unsupportive campus climate is associated with poor academic performance and high dropout rates among African-American students. Many interviewees describe their experiences being the only Black person in their classes, academic programs, and housing arrangements. And the majority also shared experiences with microaggressions on and off campus. They discussed how this impacted their academic and social validation and overall sense of well-being and belonging. Next slide. So I have a couple quotes here, and I'll just go ahead and read. I'll try to read both of them. So the first says, in my academic space, I definitely don't feel validated because I'm the only Black person. There's no one to really fully be honest with and be able to debrief with who can understand my experience. And yes, I have friends, but they are Latinx or they're white. Within my department specifically, my white lab mate tries so hard to be very inclusive, but she can't help that she's white. So she can sympathize, but she can't understand really and truly. So I just feel sort of alone in that space. The next quote says, recently, one of my professors made a very interesting comment that shook me to this day. I think it took me a minute to even realize how harmful the effect was, to where he asked me if I knew my father. I'm applying to grad school this round, so I was asking him for a letter of recommendation. And in that, he was just kind of asking me about any disadvantages I had. And in that, he asked if I knew my father because he knows that among African-American people, that's something we had to deal with, I guess. He tried to explain myself, and that really hurt me because I spent a lot of time actually in his lab. And so, yeah, like these are just a couple quotes among like so much other data that I collected that kind of highlights this poor campus racial climate experience, right? And so thinking back to that definition that UCOP shares, where it's the current attitudes, behaviors, and standards of faculty, staff, administrators, right? Like, and then all the level of respect for individual needs, abilities, and potential. These were two quotes that I thought I would highlight because it really underscores the lack of a healthy campus climate. Next slide, please. The next significant finding that I'd like to share is around housing insecurity and homelessness. And so the majority of participants reported being extremely rent burdened or spending more than 50% of their income on housing. They also expressed experiencing multiple moves over a short period of time. So due to such a high expenditure for housing, rent burdened individuals often struggle to afford necessities such as food, clothing, transportation, and medical care, which was something that was discussed in many of these interviews. Rent burden is associated with increased stress and overwork, poor physical and mental health outcomes, and reduced time for communal, family, leisure, and cultural activities, according to the No Place Like Home project, which was conducted by Miriam Greenberg and other UC Santa Cruz faculty. So next, I explored home as a concept in this project. And so the participants, I realized, have many different conceptions of what home means. And so when they were asked to define home, it became evident that the majority of participants do not find home in Santa Cruz or at UCSC, even if they're housed here. And so I want to make that distinction. While like somebody might be housed, but they can be homeless if they don't have those needs being met. And so I can share, if you do the next slide, please, I can share with you a definition of what one student said home means to them. And so the last quote says, "Home has been a loaded word in my life. I never had a single home. I had homes, I would say. So that really enforced to me that home is a place where you just feel comfortable and you feel safe and you feel secure. And I do feel like I'm living in the dorm or living in the apartment and living in that house off campus. Those weren't a home. Those were just places to stay more so." And so I think, again, with many of the other responses that I received, the emphasis of home was around feeling secure, feeling safe, feeling comfortable, feeling like they could be themselves, feeling like they belong, right? And so that was a really big theme around homelessness for Black UCSC students. And then going back to housing insecurity, there was also another quote that I'd like to share. I'll share the second one. This person says, "Sleeping in your car sucks, especially in Santa Cruz, because there's not a lot of places that you can do it, and you can't do it on campus for whatever reason. Then during the fires, I was house hopping as well, and that sucks, and until I was finally able to get a spot on campus. That was pretty much it. It's like finding a place in Santa Cruz when I first got here, and then the fires." So yeah, I won't share the other quote just for the sake of time, but those can hopefully provide some insight as to like some of the experiences that ABC students have here in Santa Cruz and on campus. Next slide, please. So when asked in my interview, what can UCSC do to better support the housing and social experiences of ABC students, we received so many amazing recommendations, and I really hope that everybody can take the time to read them, because again, like in the spirit of working collaboratively and creatively to respond to some of these issues and needs, I think that it's best to hear it from the people who are currently going through it and dealing with these problems firsthand. So next slide, please. I'll just go ahead and read through a few of these because there's a lot, but yeah, free housing for ABC students as reparations. That's one thing that I thought was really significant, especially around the concept of the different microaggressions that ABC students at UC Santa Cruz face. This was something that was offered as kind of an incentive for Black students to be more genuinely recruited and have higher retention rates and academic success at UCSC. Beyond that, other recommendations around housing include 4-year guaranteed housing and priority for Black students, more intentional Black themed housing like Our Path or Rosa Parks African American themed housing, more affordable and or subsidized or below market rate campus undergraduate and graduate housing. So like another thing that students expressed was that many students want to live on campus, but sometimes it ends up being the more expensive option depending on like what's available in the housing market. And so that was something that a lot of students pointed out, where they wanted to have the convenience of living on campus, but it actually didn't make sense for them to take out loans and grants and apply all of the money they would be using towards school for like subpar housing. And then ensuring that ABC themed housing options are desirable or up to par with the nicer and newer housing options that are well maintained and that Black students are prioritized to inhabit those spaces. So one participant stated that they wanted to live at ABC housing, but then they noticed that most of the ABC themed housing units were like had issues with like plumbing or water, or like had a lot of damage or were really old, and things like that kind of discourage students from selecting that option. And then, yeah, more scholarships or funding specifically around housing, increasing the expected off-campus rent costs and financial aid packages to meet the actual cost of living in Santa Cruz. So that calculation needs to be adjusted. And then, yeah, I'll go ahead and move on to the next slide. So I'm going to skip this for the sake of time. There's more quotes there that kind of substantiate those recommendations, though, if you guys would like to take time to read them later. Next slide. Okay, so recommendations for campus climate. Allocating more resources to ABC students to address mental health issues and academic success. Admitting more ABC students to diversify the campus population. So again, that was something that came up in pretty much every interview, students noticing that they were the only Black person in their classes or in their programs or in their departments or in their housing or at some kind of event or function. And so that's something that, based in the literature too, can really impact a student's academic success, achievement, sense of belonging, mental health, well-being, all of the above. Beyond that, more anti-racist spaces and more safe Black spaces as well. Listening to Black students when they voice their needs and concerns and acting on it. Doing a better job hiring people who are actively working on their implicit biases and reducing harm. Facilitating and mandating anti-racist and anti-Black trainings every quarter, including students in making decisions that affect them, actual consequences for people who do racist things, and more Black events and support beyond Black History Month. And so you guys can already see how like many of these recommendations overlap with the things that Aya said, and I'm sure that many of the things that Maysoon will say later too will have overlapping thoughts and interests. Next slide, please. And so moving on to what I think is a creative response to solving issues around housing insecurity, affordability, academic success, and sense of belonging. So it's well known that culture centers provide safe space and support while fostering belonging for racially minoritized students at predominantly white institutions and just at universities in general. And so culturally themed housing can really benefit racially minoritized students, like cultural centers, by emphasizing history, contemporary issues, and the culture of diverse racial groups. Because these culturally themed housing options only differ from culture centers in that students actually live in these spaces, so they're more like a living learning community, connections can be made regarding how they may serve those students. And so in this photo here, you'll notice this is actually UC Santa Barbara's Biko housing co-op, which is located in Isla Vista. And that is their like people of color housing co-op. Next slide, please. Oh, I forgot to say, when research participants were asked if they would be interested in an off-campus culturally themed cooperative housing model, all 14 participants affirmed their approval and interest. Moreover, participants described the need for this kind of housing model at UCSC and in Santa Cruz in general. And the establishment of this kind of housing model coupled with intentional programming is a critical component of deliberate recruitment and retention for a more inclusive, diverse campus community. So yeah, now we can look at examples of UCSB and UC Berkeley instituting those kinds of housing models. So in the case of the Biko Housing Co-op, this was UCSB's response to the affordability issue of housing in Santa Barbara and Isla Vista. And so their aim is to provide a low rent alternative regardless of gender, race, social, political, and religious affiliation, thereby implementing the Santa Barbara Student Housing Co-op organization's greater mission of eliminating prejudice and discrimination in the community. This house was named after the founder of the Black Consciousness Movement and anti-apartheid leader, Stephen Bantu Biko, and it's unique in that it aims to maintain a safe space for people of color in a predominantly white community. And so, yeah, I think that this is a really cool response for some of the issues that were outlined in the literature and also in my research interviews, and along with the recommendations that many students provided. There's a lot of really great governance models for co-ops as well that I would suggest looking into more for future research if this is something that it will be seriously considered in the future. And then beyond that, I think that this is a great example of how social support networks can be institutionalized through housing. And so another example at UC Berkeley, they actually have two POC housing co-ops, but the one that is African-American themed is called the Afro House. And so this one fosters a supportive community for people of all backgrounds, which again, I actually forgot to mention that both of these housing co-ops don't necessarily decline anyone from living there, but they give priority to African, Black, and Caribbean students, right? And I think that they also select who lives there based on like what their major is. So like if they're a critical race and ethnic studies major or a Black studies major or something along those lines, that's how like their selection process works, which I thought was a really creative idea, especially like considering one of the issues with our path that I've heard others speak on, where it's like, oh, sometimes there's an issue of like making sure that it's filled, right? And so it's like, okay, well, there's people who are interested in living in these spaces, and they might not, if the issue is filling up these housing options, then like there's other ways we can approach that. But ideally we would have a better ABC student population where it would be completely full. And so the UC Berkeley Afro House is devoted to serving the local African American community. Both houses that I shared with y'all are really huge. The Biko house has 18 members, 12 bedrooms, and 6 bathrooms, which is like, oh my gosh, I've been there before, and I can't even think about what cleaning looks like because it's just like so massive. But I haven't been to the UC Berkeley Afro House. This one has 21 members and 11 bedrooms. Not really clear as to like how many bathrooms, but yeah, they're made to provide enough room for many students and accommodate their needs. Next slide, please. And so finally, moving to the conclusion, thank you guys for bearing with me. I know my presentation was a little bit longer than expected, but yeah, final thoughts and conclusion. Academic success, housing, well-being, and institutional support are all interconnected, and they all influence each other. Santa Cruz's housing crisis, coupled with a legacy of discrimination and exclusion in housing, compounds the issue of academic achievement, security, and well-being for ABC students. And just based on this research project that I've been working on for the past year, it is just so imperative that this data be taken seriously, and that UCSC takes on the responsibility of maintaining a safe space and a respectful space for people of color in a predominantly white city to more appropriately address issues pertaining to the ABC community on campus and at large. Thank you guys so much for listening today. I hope that this was insightful, and I am ready to answer any questions if there's any.
All right, I see one hand. Well, I see lots of hands clapping. Thank you, Lindsay. So I saw first Shah, and please let me know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and then Teresa.
Thank you. Yeah, it's Shah. Pronouns are they, them. Thank you, Lindsay, for that really thorough, well-outlined presentation. I really appreciated your introduction and your framing as well as the results you shared. And I did want to highlight 2 that I thought were really important. I thought your point about quality of housing that's offered to ABC students was really important, as well as framing this housing as not only reparative, but as reparations. So I really just want to uplift that. And I also had some questions about, so there was a point where you mentioned grad students and cost of living in the Bay Area around, or in Santa Cruz in the Bay Area around that, as well as disabled students' access to housing. And so I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit more to that. I feel like UC Santa Cruz as a campus is rather inaccessible to disabled people in general. So I'm curious about what may have come up around access to housing on campus for those types of students.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much, Shah, for all the praise and for asking those questions. Yeah, I wish I could share like more data and information, but I do have time constraints. And so I guess just going back to the issue around like grad student housing, when I was interviewing grad students, something that they were mentioning was that there aren't enough on-campus graduate housing options. And the ones that are available are like so expensive that it ends up not being worth it. I mean, you know that there was a whole strike to raise the cost of living for grad student workers. And so one of the grad students I interviewed shared that, yeah, they were spending more than 50% of their income on rent, and that was with an off-campus housing option. And so I imagine that if they were going with the on-campus housing option, that it would actually still be more than that, which isn't appropriate when it comes to like considering all the other factors that are included in the cost of living. And so, yeah, that was one of the recommendations, was to provide more alternatives. And somebody even mentioned there's like an in-house scientist program or something like that, where like basically grad students can like work and in exchange for housing, but that those spots are very limited. And so they were just trying to think of creative ways to be able to like sustain the cost of living. And that was one of the recommendations. As far as like for disabled Black folks and trans Black folks, again, like I mentioned earlier with the recommendations and just with this overall study, like a lot of the information, it's not representative of everybody's experience, right? And so like it's important to consider that like there's all these different intersectional identities, right? And so even with within like certain like POC housing, for example, like there can be folks with many different identities who potentially aren't aware of transphobia or the transphobic things that they do, or the way that they might be ableist in their actions, right? Or even just like the design of the university being very ableist and like having lots of stairs and hills. And some folks also mentioned like where certain housing was located on campus and like the distance that folks had to walk in order to get back home, and not feeling safe, you know, doing those walks at night, feeling sketched out around like with, you know, somebody popping up and having people following them and things like that, where that's kind of where the need was highlighted.
Awesome, thanks for that question. All right, Teresa and then Cindy.
Hi, Lindsay. Thank you very much for your presentation. I agree with Shaw that I think that your framing of the idea of home is so important, and really something that I hope that the university can continue thinking with. I thought that your point about the university as a potential source of stability for ABC students is also critically important, and really melds into retention and graduation rates and future success that are really important. My question is about the co-op being, because that would be off campus, right?
So yeah, I think that that would be the ideal option, especially because like many people have commented on the fact that UCSC is inaccessible. It's like its own little island, isolated on the top of this hill. And for many students, especially students who don't have a car, who don't have access to transportation, but like want to see a more diverse community, right? Their only way of doing that would be to like live closer to downtown, or be closer to like grocery stores and finding their basic needs, things like that. And so that was the intention around like having some kind of off-campus option. I know that there's what is it called? I think it's the ILC, the housing community that is in downtown. It's by the state, or it's by the New Leaf. Anyways, if somebody, yeah, the UTC, thank you. My brain is mush right now. But yeah, so that's like, I think a really great option to have for students too, right? And so like, kind of like moving into the spirit of like, okay, we want more off-campus, like UCSC affiliated housing, but that's also like culturally themed, and that has a specific kind of governance, because with the co-ops, there's like there's constitutional governments, and there's different like ways that they're all run. There's usually board members and folks who are like ensuring that these options can be affordable and inclusive, and that like things are being done in a very intentional way. And so, yeah, did I answer your question?
Oh, well, my question actually, sorry, I was just clarifying that it was off campus, but I think that you've added a lot of really important information about why off campus is important. But my question is about the university's responsibility in keeping students safe in off campus co-ops. So in the city of Santa Cruz, we also know that there's a lot of racism that takes place outside of campus, right? And so also just like concern about how the university is going to support students when they're not, you know, kind of like in the safety, right, of our campus limits too.
Yeah, no, I think those are excellent points to draw on. And I think another really great reason why it's important to like have that integration within like the greater Santa Cruz community is because like at the end of the day, like this is not our, like, yes, we're here to study, but like there's people who have been here, there's people who like will be here, and like we need to make sure that we're also like influencing the community that we're in a positive way. And so like I know like for a lot of folks in Santa Cruz, like there are resentments about like housing and affordability because of UCSC's impact and students coming from out of the area who can potentially afford to pay more. And so I think having a space that would be like a culturally themed housing co-op where it could be more of an intentional like learning, living community could also be a really great way to share that information with the greater Santa Cruz area, as far as like raising awareness and like having intentional programming and like workshops around racial equity and diversity. The Biko Housing Co-op actually in Santa Barbara, they're a really cool like communal space as well. They host like shows in their garage, and so it's like a place for people to come together and like play music and dance. And so like it has the potential to evolve in many different ways. And I know like there's people of color in Santa Cruz too. There's Black folks, there's Latinx folks, there's all sorts of other minorities. And so I think just to be able to see like a space for us by us like would really profoundly shift the sense of belonging for folks beyond, you know, UCSC students, which is equally important too. So yeah.
That's an awesome point. Thank you.
Cindy?
Well, thank you. First, I wanted to congratulate you, Lindsay, on a really great presentation. And actually, Shaw asked one of my questions, so thanks for that. And I wanted to hear a little bit more about the idea of how either for our path or for a potential off-campus housing, how we might think about major or minor maybe or interests maybe in the way that students are selected for those housing opportunities. And I kind of feel a tension there of building a whole community of folks who understand, and then also it's kind of exclusionary. And how do you imagine weighing those two aspects?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Cindy. And so I think that the way that you see, and so like I said, these co-op housing models, they have like different constitutions and forms of governance that are ran by board members. And so like those decisions can vary from co-op to co-op. But at Biko, I'm pretty sure that they do give priority to students who identify as African, Black, or Caribbean, or Latinx, or Asian American Pacific Islander. And then from there, they also accept applications from students who are majoring in different kinds of ethnic studies programs. And so UCSB has their own list of ethnic studies programs. And then there's usually like a pretty thorough application process. And then there's also an interview process. And so it is competitive. Like it's not like it's a free, you know, just kind of, okay, you're in. And that's because like they want to preserve the intentionality of the space and make sure that like whoever's involved is gonna be a good fit for the space and give back to the space. And with co-ops too, like a lot of the components is like participating in communal cooking and cleanup and hosting some kind of event, or in the case of the Berkeley Housing Co-op, like they're dedicated to serving the Black community in the Bay Area. So like it's an expectation for them to put in at least like 4 hours a quarter into like some kind of public service or volunteering. And so, yeah, I guess the answer is it depends. In the case of our path, you know, I think that that's something that could potentially, or any of the other Black themed on-campus housing, I think that there needs to be, if there isn't already, an established committee of people who are like governing these spaces and preserving the intentionality as well, because something students highlighted was also like, as a recommendation, was pairing roommates with each other better based on their identities and interests. And so Even like within the Black student population, like there's some folks who might just not get along based on their interests, or who might have conflict based on their identity. And so yeah, just making sure that this is as intentional as possible.
Awesome. Are there any other questions from anyone? All right. Seeing none, I will pass it to Rihanna to introduce our break, right?
Yes. Thank you, Lindsay, so much for your presentation. It's always a joy to watch you talk about such important things, such as basic needs and thriving. It's really important for not just our Black students, but our Black staff and faculty to have an experience where they have their basic needs met, including safety, housing, and access. So I'm really excited for you to bring up those topics and share what our students' experiences are on campus. I will be taking us to break now for 5 minutes. So I will see y'all back at, let's do 1:59. Let me turn back on. Oh, it is with my honor and privilege to introduce our last fellow, Maysoon, who will be talking about Black Muslim identity at Ucsc. As mentioned earlier, this is a topic that I feel has not been spoken about quite often on our campus, and I'm really excited for Maysoon to share the research that she has done this year with support from Saskias, also a wonderful faculty on campus. So hopefully this isn't the beginning and ending of this conversation, and that what Maysoon is about to share is sparking a continual conversation that is much needed on our campus. So Maysoon, go ahead.
Thank you, Rihanna. Okay, so hi, everyone. My name is Maysoon Hussain. I'm a Pan-African Research Fellow, and my topic is on safe spaces for Black Muslim students. So the purpose of this, next slide, sorry. So the purpose of this research is that it centralizes the experiences of Black Muslim students to promote a sense of belonging and mental well-being for these students. These are my two overarching questions. How does the prevalence of anti-Blackness and Islamophobia affect the safety, sense of belonging, and mental well-being of Black Muslim students? How has the lack of institutional support impacted Black Muslim students? And what spaces on campus facilitate a sense of belonging and mental well-being for these students? So this research highlights unheard voices of Black Muslim students, and it centers on the lived experience of these students and the greater socio-political biases that are embedded within institutional practices. Next slide. So this is my literature review, and well, it's brief, but I split it up in two parts. The first part is Islamophobia and anti-Blackness in higher education. And this is, these are some quotes that demonstrate how these things are institutionalized. So representations of Islam and Muslims generally cohere in their identification of a pattern of negative stereotyping. Underlying Islamophobia, Muslims are associated with militancy, danger, and anti-Western sentiment. The treatment of the education system as if it was existing in a social vacuum, with the school and college of being some sort of utopia, has been criticized by many Black and white radical writers, who are more inclined to locate education within a much wider structural analysis. This demonstrates further that educational institutions are influenced by external societal ideologies and must directly address these biases in order to prevent the perpetuation of anti-Black or Islamophobic perspectives from being institutionalized and perpetuated within the school system and beyond, because, you know, education has a duty of creating people who are going to go into the workforce who have certain perspectives, and education is a tool for subverting these perspectives and creating a more holistic society. So next slide. So this is a key part of my research, counter spaces, belonging, and mental health. And so I'll just define what these spaces are. These spaces provide a safe haven for these students that shelters them from anti-Blackness that is so prevalent within their institution and facilitates a space for maintaining strong ties that are derived from cultural heritages. Counter spaces offer the room for marginalized students to cope with the the result of constant psychological, cultural, and emotional coping mechanisms with the racial microaggressions in a less than ideal, racially hostile, or unsupportive environment. This illustrates how anti-Blackness and Islamophobia impact students in a multitude of ways. Therefore, support for these students is imperative, and creating spaces that facilitate that support based on cultural heritages or other types of similarities is a primary resource for reducing the effects of these ideologies upon their daily lives and promoting their mental well-being, sense of belonging. Next slide. So as Lindsay and Dr. Jones also touched on, critical race theory was the theoretical framework for my research because it introduced me to the idea of counter spaces, which is essentially my recommendation for Black Muslim students. So my participants consisted of 2 interviews with Black Muslim participants. One of the interviewees was an undergraduate student and the other was a graduate student. So the procedure was creating an interview protocol and having it verified by faculty. And these interviews were an hour-long semi-structured interviews consisting of 15 questions, and conducting interviews with these participants, receiving the transcripts, and finally coding the transcripts through the software in vivo to determine what the results were. The participants discussed their lived experiences at UCSC and were able to illustrate a pattern that was documented within the literature review. Of course, there's no essentialized way of being Black and Muslim because there are many other intersections that are embedded within this identity. Rather, these students were able to illustrate an overlapping ideology for the need for safe spaces for Black Muslim students that promote a sense of belonging and mental well-being. Next slide. So my findings were consisted of 4 themes, but for the sake of time, I just put the counterspace theme into 1 for the presentation. So my first theme was institutional failure to support. The second is counterspaces of belonging and mental well-being. And the third is discrimination, which is the overarching theme for anti-Blackness and Islamophobia. Next slide, please. So institutional failure to support. So this theme is defined as the university's failure to provide this population with the accurate accommodations that they have requested due to the invisibility that the institution subjects them to. This code also demonstrates the ways in which support can be facilitated in the way that the students would like. So a demonstration of this theme. I know on my hand I can count how many Black Muslim students that I know. It's not an accident, you know. I know the university needs to do a better job of bringing in teaching staff and bringing in more consistent and active message that they're doing something, not just saying that they're doing something. Next slide. So counter spaces. This theme is defined as spaces that shelter Black Muslim students from the prevalence of anti-Blackness and Islamophobia for the purpose of promoting their mental well-being and belonging. So this demonstration of this theme I have a bunch of quotes, but I'll read a couple of them. I think the most telling one is, but on campus, I don't really know if I have a place where I could express my Muslim identity. And then, yeah, well, I've been thinking a lot during our talk about this queer Muslim group that I go to outside of UC Santa Cruz, and it's virtual. So thank God for the pandemic, because that's why I have access to it. But I don't see really any intersectional places. Next slide. Discrimination. This theme is defined as microaggressions that are based in Islamophobic and anti-Black subscriptions. This demonstration for this theme is, for example, people have questioned whether I'm even Muslim and I wear a scarf full time. I know that there was an incident with a professor and his TAs saying Islamophobic statements to his teaching assistants. I think one of them was Muslim. Next slide. So finally, these are my recommendations. My first recommendation coincides with what my fellows also stated, which is to hire more ABC identifying staff and faculty. The immediate departmentalization of CRES before the end of 2021 school year as a basis for the continued development and establishment of Black studies at UCSC. And this coincides with the Black Student Union's demands of 2021, the unrelenting anti-Blackness. And it would be a useful tool for subverting the ideologies of Islamophobia and anti-Blackness. As said before in the literature review, education is a tool for ameliorating these issues. Implementing a prayer space for Muslim students in every college. We just got a prayer center. It's called a Mindful Center, and it's located in the Quarry, which is a centralized location, but based on the interviews, students felt that it was too far from their classes and they weren't able to really use it for prayer. And it's not a big enough space for Friday congregation, which demonstrates that it's not very useful and doesn't coincide with their requests. And then my final recommendation is to hire full-time counselors who are well-versed in religious frameworks such as Islam. And yeah, thank you very much. So you can, yeah, thank you.
Really awesome, Maysoon. Yes, we have our first hand here. Aya.
Hey, I'll lower my hand. So wonderful presentation. My question for you is, what are your thoughts about collaborating in terms of faculty and staff that are Muslim across the UC system? Because I know at UC Santa Cruz, there's a limited amount of Black Muslim identified faculty. So what are your thoughts on potentially expanding that network across the UC system? Have you given that any thought, or do you have any ideas about how that could be useful for the Black Muslim student experience on campus?
Thank you for that question, Aya. And I definitely think that would be useful for actually understanding what ways they've dealt with ameliorating the issues that Black Muslim students face. But I haven't fully researched that because my research was centered on making our campus a better space, but definitely their insight would help us figure out the tools that would make us a better campus. And you and I have discussed, there is a faculty member at UC Santa Barbara who focuses on Muslim and Black diaspora. And I think that his information, which is actually seen in my literature review, is really essential for how to make this a better space, because we do see the prevalence of anti-Black prescriptions and Islamophobia, and it's been going on since, the war on terror. So definitely we need to do our job as educators and as scholars to make sure that we're reducing these effects of anti-Black and Islamophobic violence.
Awesome. I looked away for like half a second, and then there were three hands. So I will go in order as I see them. So let's start with Shah, and then Lindsay and Cindy.
I just want to say, wow, mashallah, like shukran Maysoon for doing this work, like such important research. Thank you for your time and literature review and putting this together. I think it's a really important way to like close these presentations with this cultivation of communal space and how counter spaces can be made on campus. So thank you for that. What struck me in your presentation was just how clearly intertwined like Blackness and Islam were in these people's identities. So I was wondering if you could speak more to like the role of intersectionality here and how that can help like highlight some of the important meeting grounds where anti-Blackness and Islamophobia meet, where Black identity and Muslim identities meet, etc.
Yeah, thank you, and shukran as well. So basically, it's really interesting because the people that I did interview had two different ways of presenting their Black and Muslim identity. So I feel like through the literature reviews as well, there's a trend of having to present yourself as more Black and kind of negate your Islamic identity just to protect yourself, because you're dealing with these multiple marginalities and you're in such a precarious position because there's hatred for both of your identities, right? So one of the counter spaces that we see on campus is the MSA. And one of the interviewees felt like it wasn't a very safe space and had anti-LGBTQIA prescriptions and anti-Black prescriptions. And furthermore, like, being Black and Muslim has multiple other identities that are embedded in that one identity. There's so many intersections, right? So the Muslim Student Association, excuse me. So that space wasn't very welcoming to certain people who had a Black identity and a Muslim identity. So there needs to be a counter space that really is encompassing all of these intersections. And I think that the best way to do that is by listening to more students and having a bigger pool of research and seeing what resources they would like. And I think that Jamia prayer which is Friday congregation, would be the most important way to really adhere to these counter spaces or create counter spaces, because people could see that there's more Muslim students on campus, and there's all types of different ways of being Muslim. And we could really see these intersections by having people to have a space to congregate and then split up and create even more communities and more counter spaces that align with their direct intersections. So I think the most important thing to do is just create spaces where congregation can happen. That's the first way to deal with this. And then also understand the experiences of these students.
Thank you. Very important takeaways.
All right, Lindsay.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Maysoon. This was so amazing to hear you share all of your research. Definitely not enough research on the intersecting identities of Blackness and Muslim identity. And so I just really appreciate you stepping into that and taking that on. I also really appreciate your perspective on counter spaces, just with some background that I have on Black geographies and thinking about the ways that Black folks have developed spaces in spite of all of the other things in society kind of telling them no, you don't belong here. And so kind of reclaiming that space. And it reminded me too of Black Wall at UCSC, Black students, on Fridays, taking up the quarry and dancing and just being happy and joyful together and being blackety black, just in our full happy selves. And so I feel having a space for prayer in that same way is so important, right? And can really foster more cultural competency and create that sense of belonging. My question to you is, so you mentioned that there was a prayer center that was opened up recently and that it there was an issue of capacity, but I'm also wondering too, if what your experiences, thoughts, or any other things that you've heard about how that space has been respected, and just kind of keeping in mind that, because it is a multifunctional space, right? It's technically called a meditation room. And so maybe if you could just talk, if you could just talk a little bit more about how that space is respected and just kind of the things that are required for prayer, because I'm also familiar with some of the sort of standards of what happens when folks pray. So yeah.
No, that's actually a really great question, and definitely a discussion that I've had recently. So in the sake of the university wanting to make it an inclusive space and not, prescribe to exclusionary practices, it was opened up to all types of religious identifying people. And I think that that's a great message to send, because we don't want to exclude people. But through that, it's the perpetuation of invisible, making the Islamic background invisible and negating their needs. So the first issue is that when you're praying, you have to take your shoes off because you're putting your head on the ground and you have to wash and everything. So it's about, making that space a clean space in order to actually practice your faith in the way that it's supposed to be. And in the sake of making it inclusive, that cannot be enforced, right? Because it's supposed to be a space for everyone. But then it really just makes it more of a harmful space for Muslim students because they can't practice their faith in the way that they're supposed to. So I think that that space is a great step at first, but it's definitely created more issues because it's in the quarry. And when we were still able to be on campus, it was people would have to go to prayer. And there on Fridays, like there's students there who are, you know, advocating for their own, you know, freedom of speech, their different clubs, all types of things. But, you know, with the surge of like Trump supporters and those kinds of ideas on college campuses, you can hear students praising like a person who's had violent assaults on Muslim people for 4 years, and they're praising him, and you have to go and pray, and that's just completely problematic because it's so visible, which makes it not a safe space. It's directly in contradiction with the needs of Muslim students because they're hearing people praise violent ideologies when they're supposed to be having a space where they can really take in their faith and have it be private and, you know, be in community with one another. But instead they're feeling vulnerable and not embraced, and it makes them feel further alienated. So that space really does have some contradictions that we really need to look into.
Yeah, that's deep. Next up, Cindy.
Thank you, Maysoon. Could you say your name for me? Because I want to make sure I get it right.
No, yeah, you said it right. It's Maysoon.
Okay.
Like May is coming soon.
Thank you, Maysoon. It's a pretty name. So I really enjoyed everything you said. The counter spaces, I hadn't heard that language before, but the idea really resonates with me. So it's nice for me now to be able to use that name. But my question was about the counseling services, and I wonder about how you and other students feel about accessing counseling remotely. The reason I ask about this is I go every week to the Council of Chancellors. We meet and we share information. And for, Chancellor Hawgood, who's chancellor at San Francisco, says that, you know, they have a large hospital system and that they've seen such great enthusiasm for remote appointments with psychiatrists and psychologists. And I could imagine that we could continue to make use of those kinds of services in the future. What I've heard anecdotally from Vice Chancellor Bazil is that can be a good solution, but not every student has, you know, a private space in which to speak with a counselor, right? And so, we would face the same kind of an issue, I worry, about trying to have sort of private spaces for those kinds of meetings. We would also want that to not be in any way sort of stigmatized or called out. I just seems like a complicated issue, but we ought to be able to thread the needle and find a solution. And I just wanted to hear your perspective.
Yeah, I think that that's a great idea, and with the aspiration to make it more accessible. But then again, we have other issues like internet access. Not everyone has a computer with a camera, and like you want to be able to see somebody and speak with them so you know that you're connecting and being heard, right? So I think it's really important to just make sure that we're offering I think it's an issue of hiring more than anything. If we have the faculty that can, of like professional counselors who can support these students, then we won't really have a problem of like not having enough space and time to have these private moments, because mental health is such an issue today, and like especially with the pandemic, you know. And I have seen some of my housemates or even myself go to like therapy group sessions on Zoom and things like that, and it's great for intermediate issues, but not really great for like long-standing issues, especially for people who face multiple marginalities. I think it's really important to, you know, just hire faculty, hire staff, and make sure that we're demonstrating an alliance towards making sure that people don't have to deal with mental health issues. And I think that Zoom is a great tool, but there's just so many contradictions that'll lead people to feel like it's not actually doing anything for them and making them feel safer or better. And counseling really is a counter space. It's a space that makes you feel a sense of belonging, and being heard is more important than anything for especially people who feel alienated. So just having that human connection, I think that that's more imperative than Zoom.
Yep, thank you. That I can sure imagine that that's right, but I appreciate hearing it from you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I appreciate that.
Indeed. Any other questions for me soon?
I have one more like follow-up question. So just kind of like with what you said about the like visibility and like location of the current space, I'm wondering like where you think would be a more ideal location, because like, yeah, UCSD is a public campus. I also feel like the quarry itself is like a very like public accessible space. So like I was wondering like, oh, well, maybe if it's like in a more residential area or like in a place on campus where it's kind of like, if you know, you know, but like most people aren't kind of like wandering into it. And then, but then I'm also thinking back to like some of the recommendations that students made in my interviews about housing and sort of like not wanting to be super like far away. And so, yeah, just like based on your own personal experience and the research you've done, like what would be an ideal location to kind of like preserve the integrity of that space and make sure that it's functioning the way it's supposed to?
That's a great question. And also, I think that it's important to note that UCSC already has an issue of space in general, like housing crisis and everything like that. But like literally having study rooms be turned into quads. But I think that it'd be a great model to have these prayer spaces be model like study spaces at each college, so that you in your college, you know, you have access to that space. And if say you're at Cowell but you live in Oaks, you can go to the one in Cowell, and it'll be like you have knowledge about that, so you can just go to this space and, you know, be present and be able to pray with other people who are in that college. Would also allow people to have new social connections, you know, new networks, because you're going to this college and you're praying with this community member that you've never met before, because it's spread across campus instead of being one centralized location that's really tiny and not able to accommodate to the needs of these students. So I think it's really important to make it more spread out, and that demonstrates that we really do care about attacking Islamophobia head on, because we're showing an alliance with Muslim students, and which would also increase retention and also increase more students wanting to come and apply to UCSC, because it's like, oh, this school actually does care about my group of people, and I don't need to feel like I'm alienated, or I don't need to feel like I have to hide my Islamic background because I'm afraid of what people would think, and I'm afraid of Islamophobic backlash. Because the school is a safe space. So I think that that's really the first step.
All right, any other questions, thoughts? Well, I'll just say that I, number one, want to thank so much all of the fellows for their work. They've really done a really awesome job, and it's hard fought, I can assure you. And I think I want to thank you all for your engagement as well, for the questions you've asked thus far, and I know that there's another element, but I just wanted to, you know, fit this in. This is what happens when you're when you're a co-host. You can kind of edge in what you'd like when you can. But I just wanted to say that and surface that. And thank you for allowing me to be a part of this process.
Cool. So I'll jump in now. Thank you so much, Maysoon, for talking about such an important topic. And like I mentioned before, I really hope this isn't just the beginning of the conversation, or this isn't the beginning and the end of the conversation, but that we continue the conversation about how we can support our Black Muslim students through conversations around mental health, intersectionality, and counter spaces, because they don't work just one in itself. You have to combine all the conversations together. So I appreciate that. And I look forward to reading your report and continuing through the knowledge and understanding through that. Cool. So again, like Erin said, thank you to all the fellows. I wanted to make sure to give a thank you just to Maysoon, since I said thank you to all three afterwards.